Good morning. My name's Rachel Morrison, and I'm honored to welcome you to the panel, The Gene of the Law, Legal Frontiers in Biotechnology, put on by the Health Panel. Moderating our panel today will be Judge John B. Nalbandian on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, and he resides in Kentucky. He's also a graduate of the University of Virginia School of Law, and you can read the rest of his distinguished biography on the Federalist Society's website. Judge, over to you.
Thank you, Rachel. Welcome everybody to our panel. Congratulations on making it to Saturday. I know this is it's a long conference. So my understanding is this is the inaugural panel at NLC for the newly formed health practice group. So welcome and congratulations to you all on that. To paraphrase Benjamin Franklin, you've got a Federalist Society practice group now, if you can keep it. So what we've got this morning in a conference that is themed, of course, around new legal frontiers, we're going to be talking about, obviously, real cutting edge topics and technologies. So we've got a panel that I think fits comfortably within the theme of our conference. So broadly speaking, we're going to be talking about biotechnology, obviously, especially as it relates to emerging reproductive technology, gene therapy, perhaps gene editing. And then within these topics, I think we're going to talk about governance, the role of government, bioethics, a lot of different things. Now, if you think I'm being vague because this panel is tasking the limits of my generalist brain, you would be correct. But I will preview this for our panelists. I may ask you a little bit about how you think generalist judges are going to do with this technology and what kind of problems it's going to pose, even outside, of course, of the Federal Circuit, which is focused on patent and more technologically, I guess, savvy. But those of us that are not on the Federal Circuit will also have some of these issues, I'm sure. Anyway, fortunately, we have three very learned panelists today to guide us. So as with nearly every Federalist Society panel, we'll start with opening remarks. We'll have some panel discussion, a few questions from me, and then we'll conclude with audience questions. So to start us off, we have Caitlin Shelton. Caitlin is a visiting fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center's Bioethics, Technology, and Human Flourishing program. She's also a 2025-26 recipient of the Robert Novak Journalism Fellowship and is conducting a year-long research project on reproductive biotechnology and human nature. Next, we'll have Professor Alta Charo. Professor Charo is Professor Emerita of Law and Bioethics at the University of Wisconsin Law and Medical Schools. She's now the principal in her own consulting firm, where she works as a consultant to companies, government, and NGOs on biotechnology and ethics and regulatory policy. By the way, I always shortchange my panelists when I do their intros, but believe me, shortchange doesn't even begin to describe what I'm doing to Professor Charo here. And finally, we'll have Dr. David Prentice, who I am also vastly shortchanging. Dr. Prentice is the president and founding board member for the Science Alliance for Life and Technology. And among other things, Dr. Prentice is an internationally recognized expert on stem cell research and bioethics. He has almost 50 years experience as a scientific researcher, professor, academic leader, and policy advisor. He is also a fellow Kansan, so welcome. Yes. Okay, so with that, we'll have Ms. Shelton start us off.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. As you may have noticed from my bio, I am neither a PhD scientist like Dr. Prentice, nor a lawyer like Professor Charo and many of you in this room. So despite my father telling me that 13-year-old me would have made a great lawyer whenever I was litigating the time, place, and manner of my groundings, which were few and far between, I might add, I'll try not to pick any legal fights with any of you today. So why am I here? My education and career has centered around bioethics, law, and policy. I have formal training in ethics from my coursework and degree spent between Yale's divinity and law schools. I then worked on women's health policy at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So I'm always considering what emerging reproductive biotechnologies will mean for law and policy. And as the judge mentioned in my bio, I'm in the middle of a year-long research project on emerging reproductive biotechnologies and how they're shaping what it means to be human. For the project, I spend most of my time talking to scientists, lawyers, and the women, and it's usually women, for whom these technologies often promise to help and to heal. In short, I hope to bring some of the human and humanistic perspective into this conversation, lest it get completely bogged down in beakers, Bunsen burners, and the Byzantine complexities of state and federal bureaucracy. So before we get to the various technologies, practices, and techniques that probably first come to mind when you think of legal frontiers in biotechnology, I want to propose a framework for this conversation, which is necessary to making sense of the biotechnical future coming down the pike. Here's my thesis, which is not unique to me, but is a pretty faithful distillation of what you might get in any ethics program worth its salt. We cannot properly understand the task of bioethics simply by looking forward to the shape and contours of emerging technologies as things in abstraction. Questions of biotechnology and bioethics require that we also look backwards and to first principles about justice, human nature, and what we owe to posterity. We might call this kind of bifocal vision the Janus-faced task of bioethics, named after the double-faced God who simultaneously looked forward into the future and backward into the past. In science, medicine, and perhaps especially in biotech, there's this kind of desperate hope that we might find something that will help us overcome our humanity, cure all of our diseases, help us to live the happy, pain-free lives which we all hope to live. And we get caught up on progression narratives, which lead us to think that our technological advances will only ever lead us up and up. What we forget, though, is that humans have held this view in the past and have been devastated when faced with the utter depravity we are capable of wreaking on our own humankind. I'm thinking here of the atrocities of the Holocaust or of slavery, to name only two. Those are not blips on an otherwise pristine record of advancement towards some utopia. Those are facts of human nature. We are capable of great good and great evil. We should never take for granted that we are capable, if not checked, and perhaps sometimes even when we are checked, of doing evil, of perpetuating great harm on the vulnerable. Again, I'm not a scholar of the law, but this is the exact thing our founding fathers had in mind as they drafted the U.S. Constitution and baked checks and balances into our system of government. As James Madison wrote in Federalist 51, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. Right now, we are on the cusp of many momentous biotechnical advances, some of which hold great promise. Just a few months ago, a story broke about baby KJ, the world's first patient treated with personalized CRISPR gene editing technology. He is currently growing and thriving in the face of a disease that otherwise would have killed him. This technology has great propensity for good. But our technological advances, much like the development of the atomic bomb, also hold great potential for evil. In germline gene editing, which is currently self-regulated with light touch governmental oversight, edits are made at the gamete level, meaning all changes to the DNA are potentially passed on to the next generation, opening an entire Pandora's box with regard to safety concerns. There's also no guarantee that people would not use the technology to make edits beyond curative ones in an attempt to influence traits like height or skin color or IQ. In fact, there are already companies purporting to allow parents to choose such traits in their embryos right now. While they are not editing genes, they are creating copious numbers of embryos to sort and rank and select the best ones. When companies are already making money practicing eugenics, there's no reason we should trust scientists not to try it another way. I mean, eugenics literally means good genes. People got all up in arms over that Sydney Sweeney ad for good blue genes, and if you don't know about it, you don't need to know about it, claiming that it was a nod to eugenics. But some of those very critics are likely the ones purchasing thousands of dollar screening packages to literally determine which of their embryos has the best genes without noticing any contradiction. One Chinese scientist has already broken with international norms and performed germline editing on a set of Chinese twin girls, and the full effects of on those girls are still unknown. And that's not to mention a whole host of other legal frontiers in bioethics, like artificial wombs or bodyoids or in vitro gametogenesis or surrogacy, which is old, but which law is still unfit to handle, as contracts between couples and surrogates still allow for coerced abortions of wanted babies, among other issues. I'll note here as an aside that Senator Rick Scott just introduced the first ever surrogacy bill called the Safe Kids Act, the first ever. So I'm watching that with anticipation and hoping that it will have bipartisan support. It is commonly known that the U.S. is the Wild West when it comes to women's health and fertility, because so few laws govern and regulations govern our practices. Unlike most developed nations, the U.S. has no overarching federal law governing the creation, manipulation, freezing, sale, or destruction of human embryos. The fertility industry is largely market-driven and self-regulated, worth more than $8 billion annually. There are no national standards, like how many eggs can be harvested at a time, how many embryos can be created or transferred, or how the embryos should be treated, stored, or disposed of. There's a patchwork of state laws, and depending on where you are, the embryos are either treated legally as property, potential life, or juridical persons. In fact, there are many cases of people from other countries traveling to the U.S. for medical tourism, doing here what they could not do anywhere else in the world because it is banned. A Chinese couple was just discovered in California with a baby farm. They had posed as an infertile couple and contracted with dozens of surrogates. Authorities found 21 babies in their house and are still unsure whether the babies were being trafficked to China, where surrogacy is illegal and where there is a shortage of girls. By contrast, the treatment, transfer, sale, and transport of equine embryos, that is, horses, have multiple layers of regulation, both at the federal, state, and industry standard levels. Let me say that again. The U.S. has more rules governing the transfer of horse embryos across state lines than the manipulation of human embryos in a fertility clinic. Or consider the couple from Pennsylvania who purchased an infant via surrogacy despite the fact that one of the men is a convicted child sex offender. When it's harder for my Christian friends who cannot conceive to adopt an already existing child in need of a home than it is for a convicted pedophile to commission and purchase a designer baby, there is a problem with our law. Looking back, the 1950s were a similar time of great scientific promise. We discovered DNA, antibiotics became widespread, universities transformed into major research centers. But we also got out over our skis. There was a drug called thalidomide, which was widely prescribed and distributed to pregnant women for nausea, despite little evidence of its safety. The distribution of that drug is now known as the biggest man-made medical disaster ever, as it led to over 10,000 children suffering grave birth defects. When it comes to gene editing, specifically germline gene editing, we are looking at potentially not only one generation of children with genetic defects, but generation upon generation of humans with potential genetic defects due to something one scientist does in a lab today. And anytime we tamper with embryos, we are tampering with a human being at its earliest stage of development. Argue about personhood all day long, but science tells us that the moment of fertilization is when unique DNA exists and human life at its earliest stage begins. We must look to the past to help us face the future. If scientists or the industry want to self-police, by all means. But we should also have external accountability. I'm pro-innovation. Some cell and gene therapies could have incredible impacts on the way we treat disease. But we need common sense guardrails and regulation when it comes to the treatment of embryos specifically in this country. We have an interest in protecting not only ourselves, but future generations from the whims of scientists in a lab. The law encodes a vision of humanity. It reflects who we are and also shapes who we will be. We aren't just editing genes. We're editing the destiny of the human race. And we have to decide now what kind of a people we will be, whether we will use our power for good or for ill, to protect or to destroy. I'd like to close with a quote from my co-panelist here, Professor Charo. In a podcast discussing animal rights, she said, "When you use an animal or a human being just for your own purposes, like enslavement, we've come to recognize that is a wrong. That's Immanuel Kant's notion of not turning people into simple instruments of your own needs and desires, that they are an end in and of themselves. And if we were to think of animals that way too, it would put a natural limit on how much we manipulate them," end quote. I would agree, and I think we owe as much and more to the human embryo as we do to the non-human animal. Thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin. And now we'll hear from Professor Charo.
I have to tell you, it is really scary that I have absolutely no memory of saying that. But I'm glad that I quoted Immanuel Kant. I mean, because he's a lot smarter than any of us. Because this is a very broad topic, I wanted to take my time to try to put some context on this, even though I do suspect we are going to find ourselves focusing at the end often on reproductive applications. And I want to put the context also in the not only on the range of scientific applications, but also in the concept of governance, which certainly goes beyond formal government regulation, whether through statute or regulation or guidances, but also includes market forces, insurance, business models, professional standards, or just consumer desire and intrinsic limits.
Why don't we get the mic a little closer?
It's about as close as it can get. Let me move my chair.
There you go.
Okay.
Just for the studio audience.
Sorry. Yeah, David and I are sharing a mic over here. So let me start simply by noting some of the other areas that we may not get to, but are also relevant not only in general, but even to health issues. Biotechnology has made enormous advances in the agricultural sector, for example, to edit foods to enhance their stability, their nutrition, their sustainability, even to make it safer for workers who no longer have to apply pesticides in the field. But it is intrinsically limited by things like consumer understanding and acceptance of bioengineered foods, or in some cases, a resistance to the change in kind of the economic dynamics of the agricultural sector. In the environmental area, we now have seen how you can use genetic changes to alter things like mosquitoes and drive a change in the nature of the mosquito's genetic components so that they are no longer able to transmit diseases like dengue fever or Zika, which are devastating. But at the same time, we have intrinsic limits in their use, both because of the challenges of ecosystem modeling and being able to predict exactly what will happen once they're released, as well as the nature of public concerns and fears. There's an enormous range of interesting applications in the military sector, whether it comes from being able to use biological materials as alternatives to inorganics. We can now think about growing recyclable runways in the field in war zones, as opposed to having to truck in all amounts of concrete. But we can also talk about enhancing the warfighters, whether being able to create therapeutics on site or implanting devices that can release therapeutics or prophylactics when they might be exposed to toxic substances in the field. But there are, of course, going to be concerns about the way that these kinds of enhancements might move into the consumer non-military sector, as well as the possibility that they can begin the beginning of a different form of an arms race in the kind of super soldier imagination. In the area of therapeutics, which Caitlin very nicely introduced to us, the rise of gene therapies like the baby KJ story, or the use of editing in order to treat sickle cell disease with a one and done cure, which has now been done, right? Instead of having people repeatedly going to the hospital after painful episodes for expensive and difficult treatments that are only partially effective. But the problem with one and done therapies is, number one, they don't fit the business model for pharmaceutical development. Instead of being able to make a penny on a pill that 100 million people take every day for 40 years, you have one shot to make all your money back, which means you get price tags of like $3.5 million for a therapy, which is going to be unsustainable. So the business model, as well as the intrinsic costs of manufacturing a biologic as opposed to more traditional drugs, becomes a problem. For the reproductive area, we've seen the use of biotechnology since the mid-20th century for an increasing range of ways to produce embryos through in vitro fertilization, and now more recently, something called in vitro gametogenesis, which could, in the future, take a skin cell and turn it into egg or sperm. Kind of amazing. Or to screen embryos, which you had mentioned, through pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, or in the future, to try and edit embryos themselves, which has, as you mentioned correctly, been done by one, I'd say, rogue scientist in China, whom I had the dubious honor of having dinner with the night before he made that announcement. And I'm happy to talk later if people would like to know a little bit more about him. The interesting thing in the reproductive technology area is that with every advance, whether it was artificial insemination in the 50s, or it was surrogacy, or it was the advent of genetic screening in the 80s and 90s, or more recently, expansions in that area, people have always worried that it's going to get used more and more frequently by virtually everybody for increasingly frivolous uses. But even here, there was an intrinsic limiting factor that governed the use of that technology, and it was the need to use IVF, which is expensive and unpleasant. And sex is cheap and fun. So people who did not need to use IVF tended not to go for these technologies unless they had a serious genetic disorder. There are a couple of exceptions, but in general, they did not expand willy-nilly the way people feared because of the intrinsic limiting factors. So my point simply is that biotechnology crosses many areas, but we don't need to think only about government regulation. We need to think about all the forces that affect how rapidly it's going to expand and into which sectors, military or civilian, when thinking about the appropriate role of government as a complement to all these other forces. So that leads to the question of, what is the best form of governance? And within that, what is the proper role of government? In the area of biotechnology, since the 1980s, the US has taken a position that we should regulate applications and not the technology per se. This is very different from the Europeans' approach to this. So we regulate drugs as drugs, whether they are created through chemical formulations or through biotechnology. We have a drug regulation regime that asks, is it safe? Is it effective? And then we decide whether or not it'll be approved. And we have a pre-market system, so there's a gatekeeping role for the government before drugs go out. If it's a food, on the other hand, things go out into the world if they're generally recognized as safe, and they're only pulled back post-market if a problem is shown to occur. So we don't have a gatekeeping mechanism, but we have a surveilling mechanism. And similarly with pesticides or other things, we always regulate the application, whether or not biotechnology was used as part of the production process. This has allowed us to be a little bit more nuanced in how we evaluate the risks and benefits of using biotechnology as a production method as opposed to something else, whereas the Europeans have had these more global approaches that basically slowed all applications of biotechnology at the same pace without really a nuanced look at the level of risk or the level of benefit that each particular use might pose for society. It makes their statutes easier to understand, but arguably less effective at giving us the optimal mix of benefits and risks. Now, that said, we have lots of problems in our formal governance. We have areas, for example, of overlapping or confusing jurisdictional issues. The FDA, the EPA, and the USDA, we are in Washington, so we only use acronyms and initials, all have overlapping jurisdiction over things like the engineered mosquito used for those gene drives to control Zika. And it took years to figure out how they should coordinate among themselves. We have statutes that were written without these ideas in mind. So when I was at the FDA, we worked on the engineered salmon, which would allow us to produce salmon in the middle of a city instead of having to ship it across country, and to grow it more quickly. It's just an Atlantic salmon like everybody eats, but it would be grown more quickly. But we didn't know for 25 years how to regulate this until it was finally decided that you could shoehorn an existing rule about veterinary drugs into something that talked about the use of genetic constructs as the equivalent of a drug, because technically it met the definition of drug and how it affected an animal. And then you could regulate the salmon based on the genetic construct being used to engineer it, which led to everybody talking about how we were regulating salmon as drugs. We weren't, but that was the way it was portrayed, because the regulatory system often is unable to adapt quickly enough with definitions and procedures that are really fine-tuned to the scientific developments. In human reproduction, and one last thing I'll say, by the way, is that public information, by the way, or so-called sunlight, that's an enormous governance mechanism as well, as you can see also in the debates around the labeling of engineered foods, or in the use of the National Environmental Policy Act as a way to give people information if they want to oppose a particular major federal action that has environmental impacts. Human reproduction, however, is something that kind of stands alone in all of this, because unlike these other areas that were predominantly about kind of a more traditional risk-benefit balance, looking at concrete harms to the environment, to animal health, to human health, versus their potential benefits, human reproduction really gets us into a deeper debate about the appropriate role of government when it comes to taking positions on the moral acceptability of certain applications that have met safety and efficacy standards. So to take the example, and I actually had the same one in my own notes, Caitlin, of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. She's absolutely right. There's an increasing number of companies, particularly coming out of the Silicon Bros in California, that are advertising the ability to screen embryos for an ever-widening range of predictions concerning long-term effects on very complex human traits that we actually don't have a good understanding of. I mean, they say they can screen for your, potential intelligence. We can't even define intelligence, let alone understand all of the factors that lead to what constitutes its presentation. But even for things that are better understood, we don't yet have full understanding of the relative contributions over time of the genetics, the epigenetics, and the other influences that lead to whether or not somebody develops Alzheimer's 80 years hence, or whether somebody develops diabetes. So their safety and efficacy standards have not been met yet, in my personal opinion. But assume that they have. Let's assume an imaginary future where they actually have got the statistical proof needed. Who should be in a position to decide which are the permissible and impermissible uses of this technology? Because we have a lot of choices. It could be up to the individual potential rearing parents. It could be up to the individual physician or other provider who decides whether or not they'll offer this service. It could be the professional societies who make a kind of professional standard for what should or should not be offered. Or it could be the state government or the federal government, getting us into the federalism questions. Whose moral standards are the ones that should control whether the technology and its applications are even available for people to choose from, right? This is a real dilemma because we live in a multicultural society in which we have fundamental disagreements about what those moral standards ought to be, and yet we are trying to all live together at the same time. So this question about the role of government when it comes to making morality-based judgments as opposed to more concrete risk that you will develop a headache judgments is a real tricky one. The second thing, and it's the one I'll end on, that comes up with these technologies, is regardless of whether you're including morality issues or not in your governance scheme at the government level, you also have to ask, what is our kind of orientation toward emerging technologies? Is it one that is permissive or not? Many, many years ago, back in the 70s, and I have not been able to find the citation on the internet to confirm it, but my memory, which apparently can't remember my own quotes, but can remember something from the 1970s. I remember something in Newsweek trying to capture national cultures. And they said, in the United States, everything is allowed until it's prohibited. And then they went on to say, by contrast, in East Germany, when it existed, in East Germany, everything is prohibited until it's allowed. They also went on, I love them for this, saying that in Russia, or in the Soviet Union at the time actually, everything is prohibited, especially if it's allowed. And in Italy, everything's allowed, especially if it's prohibited. And I thought, there's something really, really good about this. It really captured something perfect. But in a deeper, more sober way, I'd like to simply emphasize that this orientation about whether things are going to be prohibited until somebody can show a compelling need for them, or whether something is permitted until you can show a compelling reason to forbid it, usually based on concrete harm of an objective nature and not something like societal disruption or moral offense, becomes in many ways, I think, more predictive of the outcome of these policy debates than the technologies themselves, whether it's germline editing or cloning or anything else. In many ways, I think it's this orientation about governance that will determine whether something will be permitted and where it will be governed from most directly, more than the particularities of the science and technology itself. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Charo, and we'll hear from Dr. Prentice.
Thank you. And I remember the same quote, but I couldn't tell you what the source is. So at least there's some validation there.
Mutual hallucination.
That could be too. Thanks for the opportunity to be on this panel and speak to your convention. I've got to admit, it's a new experience for me being a scientist in an ocean of lawyers and judges. But I'm going to bring you my scientific perspective on a number of these new biotechnologies. And being an old professor, I'm going to start with terminology, Carnegie stages. The Carnegie stages were formally accepted as the embryological standard for human development in 1942. They cover the earliest stages of human life, and it starts with Carnegie stage 1, fusion of an egg and sperm to form a single-cell embryo or zygote. It's an organism at that point, not a cell. The Carnegie stages formally set out characteristics and recognizable for development of an organism, the human organism, for the first 8 weeks. And as a scientist, that's what I and many of my colleagues use as the basis for our bioethical decisions. When we consider these biotechnologies, one of the first questions we ask is this a human organism? And if it is, what kind of respect or value should be given it? Another way to phrase the question is simply, who counts? Carnegie stages provide an objective standard for the earliest stages of human life and for the human organism. Now, since I'm the scientist, I felt also that I need to kind of go through a litany of some of these biotechnologies to explain some of them. I'll start actually with stem cells and cell-based regenerative medicine, one that's been around for a while. You've probably heard about all of the debates and so on. There were certainly many claims made over 25 years ago for embryonic stem cells. I had one U.S. senator tell me they had the potential to cure all known maladies. Now, the problem is that, number one, you get embryonic stem cells, as the name implies, from an embryo, which are destroyed in the process. The second problem is that, in theory, you might be able to form any tissue or cell type from them, but the reality is that simply has not happened. Theory doesn't match with the reality in over 25 years of research. And in fact, in over 25 years of research, no one has been cured by embryonic stem cells, and even the animal studies are equivocal. There are other types of stem cells. Adult stem cells, for example, have to date treated over 2 million people around the globe for a number of different conditions. They're sourced usually from the patients themselves or from consenting donors, from bone marrow, umbilical cord, blood, and other tissues, and they have made good on the promise of being able to treat people for a number of different conditions. It's still a work in progress, a lot of other studies being done, but they have made good on that. One other type of stem cell you need to be familiar with is called induced pluripotent stem cells, iPS for short. These are created basically from any body cell, and you can take, for example, a skin cell, and you transform it using certain techniques to look and act like an embryonic stem cell, but there are no embryos involved. And it shows great promise already in terms of laboratory studies, and they're beginning clinical trials with it. I want to mention cloning of the old-fashioned type, I'll say now, called nuclear transfer cloning. It's the type that was used to produce Dolly the cloned sheep back in the 90s. You take a nucleus, the genome from a cell, and you transfer it into an egg that's had its nucleus removed. You formed an embryo by that transfer. Now that embryo can grow and develop and so on. Tom Brady's dog notwithstanding, it really has been a failure in terms of human biology. There are a lot of inefficiencies and inconsistencies. A lot of the embryos that have been made, human embryos, show a lot of genetic problems and so on. Gene editing is obviously a hot topic right now in the news. You need to understand that there are two types that we've been discussing. Heritable genetic engineering, or germline some people will use, and somatic gene editing. The heritable involves altering the genome of a very young embryo. You create an altered individual at that stage of life, and it means that the genetic alteration will be present in every cell and inherited by their progeny. It's already known there can be unintended consequences. We've already alluded to the Chinese scientist who did the gene editing of the two little girls. There are various things that we still don't know in terms of unintended consequences, but a number that don't bode well for these children. The inefficiency sometimes, the CRISPR enzyme that you've heard about is not 100% accurate in terms of the changes it makes in the genome. And the other thing we need to keep in mind is that heritable gene editing does not treat a condition. It creates new altered individuals in the hope that they will not acquire whatever disease or trait was targeted. But as Alta already mentioned, there are companies that are offering not just to screen your embryos now and help you pick the best one, but there are also companies that have been formed, again, the Silicon Valley group, that are intending to do gene editing on your embryos and help you create a better human being, if you will. If you haven't seen the movie from the late 90s called Gattaca, Gattaca, you might take a look at it in terms of some of the news about gene editing now. By contrast, the somatic gene editing involves resolution of an existing problem. It's an authentic therapy. It's used with existing individuals, and the target is you either remove a disease-causing gene or you insert and activate a healthy replacement. And it's already borne fruit. So I'll make the trifecta here and mention baby KJ, which we've all mentioned before. Little child who was born with a severe genetic condition, life-ending genetic condition. They were able within 6 months to come up with a personalized genetic therapy, and he is now fine and healthy and doing well. And there are other somatic gene editing technologies that are under development. Some have already been approved. Alta mentioned the sickle cell. There are others coming up as well. These, again, are authentic therapies. I'll mention just a few other things in my time. In vitro gametogenesis. The idea here is to form eggs and sperm from body cells, skin cell perhaps. There was actually a scientist recently from Oregon who showed some limited success in their area, but he actually started by first creating cloned human embryos. Then he treated the embryos in a way that turned them into egg-like cells, fertilized. A few of those embryos actually could grow for a brief period of time, but every single one of them had genetic problems. There's also another concern here in terms of that, is that your starting material is simply a human cell and its genome, which means there's a concern that an unsuspecting donor might be used to form eggs, sperm, and genetically related individuals. A couple of other terms that you're going to hear if you haven't already: organoids and embryoids, or embryo models. The organoids and the embryoids both are simply taking a collection of stem cells, some pre-treated in a certain way to start forming certain cell types. Organoids are like a mini organ. Now, they don't look necessarily like a miniature brain or a miniature kidney, but they take on some of those functions. You can actually study normal as well as abnormal development. Potentially, you can use them for drug screening, which has already been done in some cases, and possibly in the future use them for treatments. There is a concern, though, of one type of organoid, and that's the cerebral or the neural organoids. As these have developed and become more sophisticated, there's a concern now that what if you have an organoid that develops consciousness? How would you even know? How would you look at this? How would you look at it? But there have been some that have developed brain waves, very primitive types. Professor Charo and her colleagues published a paper just a couple of days ago related to this and calling on a need for governance for oversight in terms of this area of research so that we don't get out to the point where we're too far ahead and something undue has already happened. And again, you're back to the consent issue because you're starting with some cells. You can make these iPS type cells from a skin cell that I've left here on the desk and form organoids, maybe cerebral organoids from my own genetic background. The embryo models are a little more sophisticated as well. You're again taking groups of stem cells, assembling them together, but now you're making something that looks somewhat like an embryo. And the term embryo models or synthetic has been used, but the problem again becomes how far can this go and how much do they actually resemble, or are they an actual embryo as well? They may look and act just like any other embryo at that Carnegie stage that I mentioned before. And it actually raises the specter of a new and more efficient form of cloning, because if you took, again, some of my cells or some of my DNA, you started these iPS cells, and now you formed millions of embryos that are genetically related to me. What are the consequences? So, again, an unsuspecting donor could contribute to this. I want to talk just briefly in the end here about various regulations and guardrails. There aren't very many. At the federal level, we have the Dickey-Wicker Amendment, which really just precludes federal funding of a number of these types of biotechnologies, embryo formation, embryos for research or destroying an embryo. The Adderhold Amendment, which prohibits clinical use or transfer of a heritably altered genetic individual. Again, the heritable gene editing that we talked about. The Weldon Patenting Amendment has actually been in place that prohibits patenting of a human organism. And then we have various levels of FDA regulation and oversight. There are proposals underway at this point. Professor Charo will be meeting with a group of other scientists and ethicists. I don't know who all you've got invited at this point, but at Asilomar, I think it's this coming week?
Monday, assuming the plane takes off.
Right, assuming TSA can get her through. But to look at the organoid question, and especially the neural organoids. Now, what will happen? They'll come out of this, but at least starting to look ahead in terms of how do we look at regulation and governance of these types of things. There's nothing, though, at this point, there's nothing in terms of the embryo models. There's very little in terms of gene editing and so on. But it does point out that we need these types of guardrails, scientifically accurate definitions and regulations, and from my perspective, a way to get ahead of this so that we can protect the human future. And I'll end there.
Thank you, Dr. Prentice. I've got a couple of questions, but before we get to that, I would just want to go back through our panelists and see if you have any comments just based on what you heard, or any discussion you want to kind of raise.
Can I ask Professor Charo a question?
Sure.
Okay. So Alta, I really like the fact that y'all are going to be meeting at Asilomar and starting to look at this and get ahead of the game. The original Asilomar conference about recombinant DNA, they started out with a moratorium on the research and then started discussing how do we make this safe and make the public okay with it. Are y'all going to be looking at the idea of a moratorium? Are you open to the idea of a moratorium on that particular line of research?
So we're talking about an upcoming meeting focused specifically on neural organoids and organoids and assembloids, which are a more elaborated version of this. Basically, what you're talking about is trying to grow a collection of cells in a way that lets you model key aspects of brain function so that you now have something you can use for testing drugs. And it allows you to do things you could never otherwise do because non-human animals are not a good substitute. You can't generalize from them. And obviously we can't experiment on living people. And once people have died, for the moment, the brain is unable to be sustained long enough for a lot of this to happen. I can't speak to what is going to come out of this meeting because I'm not there yet. I really don't know. But I can say that the goal is to begin to try and identify those things that seem absolutely safe. Those combinations of cells that seem completely incapable of ever replicating any of the functions that are even remotely associated with things like sensation or sentience, which is a more primitive thing before you'd even get to what we might call consciousness, which, again, we can't define. And then to understand what it might be the buffer zone. Where would you want to stop so that you don't even get close to this unknowable line that might actually reach into a point at which there's something like sentience? So that's a lot of the conversation. And much of it goes way beyond my expertise because I'm not a scientist. My biology degree is an undergraduate degree, and then I moved to something a lot easier like law. So I'm looking forward to the meeting, but I really don't know how to predict what's going to come out of it.
Yeah, I think I'd like to ask Professor Charo. You were asking who should be in a position to decide the acceptable uses for a technology and what should the government's role be. And I would like to ask you that question. What do you think? Who do you think should be in that position? And what do you think the role of government should be in limiting or not some of the applications of these technologies?
Wow. Okay. I feel like I'm kind of like on the spot here. Here are some of my underlying biases. Okay. I was born and raised in the U.S., but in an immigrant neighborhood. So I'm very much aware of the kinds of atrocities you talk about because most of my family was destroyed in the Holocaust. That said, I still have a fundamental orientation toward permissiveness. So for me, I find myself nervous about having the power of the state used to enforce a particular morality that might not be my own. And that's a particular concern for those of us that come from cultures or religions that are not the dominant culture or religion in the country. So for example, while I might completely accept the definitions of the Carnegie stages or the fact that the moment of fertilization, although I argue about whether there's a moment as opposed to a process, but let's call moment of fertilization is the beginning of genetic uniqueness or the beginning of the living organism, I might have a fundamentally different view about whether or not that in and of itself tells me what the moral status of that entity might be, right? So for me, it might be that ironically, I think that the theologians and the philosophers are relying too much on science to answer a question that is fundamentally theological or philosophical.
It's funny because we got the opposite critique before, and now the science says, oh, life begins at the moment of fertilization. It's now, oh, well, this is really a question that should be left up to the theologians and the philosophers. So for me, the bottom line is I really am uncomfortable at having government make those decisions for me, and I'm much more comfortable with individuals making those decisions for themselves, up until the point at which you can actually say that there is an objective, measurable, concrete harm to someone. And I know that the problem now is defining who's the someone. Right. And so I understand why this has not been a resolvable debate. I would just say on that front that 6 out of 10 Americans still identify as Christian, and 8 out of 10 still say that there's some sort of God or higher power. And so I think we actually have a lot more in common on the metaphysical front than we think. And just because these issues are difficult to resolve doesn't mean we shouldn't try.
Let me ask a question about regulation. And it gets to the problem I alluded to when I gave the intros, which was, generalist judges, for example, are not particularly savvy about the guts of the technology, obviously, right? But the real problem is really your average state legislator or member of Congress who are going to do the first order kind of regulating. And one of the reasons why we saw the kind of rise of the administrative state was we thought maybe experts would be needed to regulate, communications and trade and whatever it was. And now we've kind of pulled back on the administrative state, right? How do you think, what kind of understanding of the technology does kind of the average legislator need in order to effectively regulate? Is it just a question of these first order principles and they can do it from that? Or is there going to be some understanding of the actual guts of the technology that they're going to have?
I'll take credit. I think they need a better understanding than just a surface view. And I definitely identify with your statement because I've given probably 100 legislative testimonies out in the states and a number at the federal and even at the international level. And usually the genesis is, I've got this idea, I'd like to prohibit this or allow this and so on, but I've got no clue as a legislator what to do and so on. And that's usually when I would get a call or Alta would get a call about, can you advise us, even in terms of drafting the legislation? So I don't know exactly how to go about getting to the point where the average state or federal legislator has a better grasp of this. I mean, as an old professor, we could always do, we can do briefings and we can do, some educating and so on. But there definitely is a need for that because often they're basing many of the things they write on misunderstandings of reality. Yeah. And they're not considering also the diversity of opinions and viewpoints and so on. So I really think we need to address that. I'm not exactly sure. Maybe we should start some sort of an educational forum where we run every legislator through and they can't draft a bill until at least in this area, until they've talked to us.
And pass the test probably too. Quiz.
Definitely that. Pop quizzes are my goal.
Yeah, first of all, I don't disagree with anything you just said, but in many ways, your focus on definitions was actually very helpful. I think that legislators without a science background are completely capable of deciding what it is that they want to accomplish. They do or do not want to allow people to make children through modern technologies, or they do or do not want people to be able to form families that are something other than a heterosexual unit. I mean, these are value judgments. But the trouble then is if they try to put it down on paper, they need expert advice to make sure they're using the right definitions. So back in the 1970s, when there had been some scandals about human subjects research that was focused on fetuses, there were legislators that wanted to write laws that said you can't experiment on fetuses. But they wrote the laws in a way that accidentally included embryos. Now, they may or may not wanted to forbid research on embryos, but they didn't know whether they were doing it or not. And it's the kind of thing where you need the expert advice to be sitting side by side with you. So the American Association for the Advancement of Science actually has an entire program called the AAAS Congressional Fellows Program that sends scientists to work for members of Congress at no cost to the member of Congress and provide them with exactly that kind of advice, and they've replicated it through the executive branch, and now they've got a state government effort as well, so that there is that kind of expert advice available. For the courts, there are judicial education seminars that are offered for this kind of thing, and there's special masters, so that you can get the kind of advice you need to make sure that you're accomplishing what you want to accomplish. But the value judgment is entirely within the realm of the policymakers and the judges.
And fortunately, I just use AI, so I'm kidding, kind of. Well, the legislators are using AI, right, to draft the legislation now,
yes.
too. So we've got that technology helping us. Do you have a comment on? Okay. Okay, so since I'm basically just a 12-year-old, I do have to ask about the super soldiers and the Captain America thing. I'm curious, though, let me ask it as kind of an ethical question. So obviously there are ethics involved in human advancement, whatever it is that we're going to do. But it's a military technology, and there's an external calculus, right? It's what are our, threat actors around the world doing? How do you see that balance kind of playing out with how this technology is going to develop and what we're going to do with this Captain America stuff?
You go first.
I'm happy to start, but I think that Caitlin may also have some comments about human enhancement potentially, which goes beyond the super soldier. But the it's the War Department now has something called the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA. These are my peeps. I love these guys. These are the people that just dream up everything that you have ever seen in the comic books or science fiction and said, can we do that? And then they work on doing it, right? They get people organized around the country to try to do these projects. So one of their goals is to enhance our military preparedness and to protect our warfighters. So they work on things like making it possible for somebody to have an extended attention span. Now, we've been doing that for years with pharmaceuticals, and most of us are doing that right now with this. So what is the difference between using a pharmaceutical or using a genetic alteration that is reversible, like an epigenetic transformation, as opposed to using a chemical substance like the caffeine in your coffee? Or being able to have embedded in people, and this is another project, and this is none of what I'm going to talk about is classified, a project in which they're looking to see whether or not you could scan somebody's genes for these epigenetic signatures. Epigenetics is kind of like, it kind of like wraps around the gene and determines how much the gene functions. If you think about like the pedals on a piano determining how loud or softly the piano plays when you hit the chords, if the chords are like the genes. So could you read the epigenetic signatures and from that determine where somebody had been and what they'd been exposed to as a way to not only figure out how to protect them, but also figure out where the weapon of mass destruction might have been located so that you now can begin to target it later on. There's a lot of possibilities. Could you pack their red blood cells so that they have a better ability to function in low oxygen environments? All of these things are on the table, and many others through things like DARPA. So is this at all different from any of the other things we do when we provide better equipment, when we provide surveillance from the air in order to tell them where they're going to be? The thing that concerns people often, though, is that number one, it gives us potentially capacities to be offensive, for offensive use that we may not have had before. If you can protect somebody from exposures in certain settings, it means you can place them in certain settings you couldn't before. So it gives you offensive capabilities. And we see this in biological weapons. The defense research needed to identify and prepare countermeasures to biological weapons is pretty much the same research you need to develop a new biological weapon to begin with. And the combination of artificial intelligence and biotechnology has rapidly expanded our capacity to explore opportunities in that space. So you are constantly risking the fact that you may come up against some of the conventions against biological weapons because it's almost impossible to distinguish between the research that's permitted and the research that's not. It also makes you vulnerable to misinformation, as was done just a couple of years ago in the context of the war between Russia and the Ukraine, with allegations about offensive biological weapon research going on in the Ukraine when it was not at all. It was all defensive. In the civilian sector, people are mostly worried about the competitive advantage issues. You mentioned cloning and the equine embryos. The one area where cloning has really taken off, ironically, is in horses and in the Argentinian and Brazilian horse racing industries, which are very big down there. And cloning has become very, very important there. And now it's being added, germline editing is being added to it. in the civilian sector, the concern has been that competitive advantages are going to exacerbate the disparities that already exist. Now, of course, we've got disparities based on education, on fundamental nutrition, on geographic location, on parental status, all kinds of things. But the concern is that we're now going to add more and more biological alterations to this menu of things we can use to distinguish ourselves from one another, and some people having access and others not would only exacerbate the disparities that we currently have. And yet, we enhance ourselves all the time, right? I'm wearing glasses, and that's on top of having had cataract surgery that temporarily gave me better eyesight than I'd ever had when I was a kid. Should they have only given me the crappy eyesight I was born with in order to not enhance me when they did that surgery? So we accept enhancements in some contexts and get very worried about them in others. In some ways, and I'll end here, some ways I think we get a little bit overly nervous whenever it's about genetics, because it feels less well understood, less controlled or controllable. And so we treat it differently in a kind of genetic exceptionalism, but we really need to contextualize it and ask generally, when are enhancements permissible and when are they not? When can they be controlled and regulated? When can they not? And think about these things in that bigger context. Sorry, that was a rant.
No, that was.
No, I think that was good. I was the only girl in a family of boys, and so I watched tons of Marvel. So I love the Captain America stuff, but it does make me nervous that our government is seeking to do this kind of thing, and I worry about the spillover into the normal public sphere, the consumerist arena. So where does that stop? I don't really know. And then also with regard to China, I was listening to the AI session before this, and people were talking about how, well, we have to make sure that we beat China. We've got to beat China to the punch. We have to do it quicker, and we want to be the ones who have it succeed. And I think a lot of the time that same argument is applied to the genetic or the biotechnical arena, where China's doing it and they have no morals, so we should just all full steam ahead. And I don't think that that's right. And I think we should talk about what our limits are and whether we're willing to do anything if we think the ends justify the means.
If I could just add on to that, I have a friend who says China is the place where ethics goes to die. But in terms of the enhancement, we really don't have a clear view unless it's something weird, like we're going to give you the eyesight of a hawk, whatever. There's a range of human capabilities normally. Mm-hmm. And, having a super baseball or football or basketball player, they have tremendous talents that I can't even get close to, though I aspired to when I was in high school. But does that mean that they have been enhanced? No. It's a matter of there's a normal human range in terms of those things. And one of the things we haven't and need to grapple with is, what is an enhancement? What's the difference, in fact, between a disease and a trait? And what we should do in terms of correcting or improving those sorts of things. And it's something that we really don't have any guardrails, we don't have any guidelines at this point, and it's something we really need to wrestle with now before things maybe get too far down the road to wrestle with it all.
I want to actually turn it over to the audience. Do we have any audience questions?
No surprise there.
Ben Slifka, retired monopolist. I wrote there was an essay in the Wall Street Journal 10 years ago, and I wrote a letter and it got published. And the two authors were Nobel Prize winning winners in medical science. And they were calling for a moratorium on certain kinds of genetic engineering research. And I wrote back that these are obviously brilliant scholars, but they're ignoring human history and human nature. And so every technology advance, whether it's gunpowder or airplanes or aircraft carriers or nuclear bombs, if it conveys a economic or military advantage, it will be pursued. And so I want to ask the question again, if Putin's going to make super Russians, if he can, he will. And if Xi Jinping can make super Chinese, he can and he will. And so what are the implications for America?
Well, Caitlin, you raised kind of the ethics and the question, what do we do if our, enemies are doing this? What are we going to do?
Yeah, I don't think the ends justify the means. I think there are some first principles that we should apply. I don't necessarily know that enhancement is in all cases wrong, but I definitely think we should be having the conversation. We should also consider, Ross Douthat is one of my favorite people. I love his column and his podcast for the New York Times. And in one of his columns, which actually inspired this project, he asked a question. He said, he was talking about humanity in an age of technological advancement and talking about what it means to be human. And he says, imagine the CCP with artificial wombs. And that image really struck me because we have close to 1 million embryos on ice. Mm-hmm. And scientists still think that full ectogenesis, bringing a baby or an embryo from a petri dish to live birth, they still think that that's science fiction. Now, there's an embryologist at Stanford who supposedly thinks we can do it in the next 10 years. I don't know. Partial ectogenesis, though, is possible. I mean, well, not possible. They've done it with sheep, mm-hmm. And that could change the face of neonatal intensive care and bring the age of viability down, which would be very interesting for state laws when it comes to viability, especially if they're like Roe and base the law on the age of viability. So that's one legal frontier to pay attention to. But yeah, I do worry if with so many embryos that are just floating out in the ether, will we see governments start trying to enhance them? Take them and say, we're just going to experiment on them, or try to create super soldiers. They have no parents. So like, there's nobody protecting them. Nobody really cares. If the parents want to turn these embryos over to us for research, then we can do whatever we want with them. It may sound like science fiction, but I don't think it's too far out in the future for us not to start thinking about whether or not we're going to allow that kind of thing.
We can get the clone army from Star Wars.
Hi, I'm Dr. Elise Fitzsands. I'm the outgoing president of the Virginia Mountain Valley Lawyers Alliance Specialty Bar. And I've been listening to each of you pose these dilemmas, and I have just one sort of thematic question across them all. So I was intrigued when you started about the idea that it's the Wild West for women looking at reproductive rights, and certainly we haven't deep dived enough into things that aren't abortion. But more importantly, it really is very different in the States. We're seeing increasing maternal mortality. And then Alta has raised the age-old question, who decides who decides? And you've talked very eloquently about the issues of definition and such, and where does that fit in a bigger question? To me, the thematic question I would like to look at is, what if we in the United States had a benchmark, a clearly articulated right to health that is either in the unwritten Constitution and we just haven't looked at it closely, or we actually sat down and tried to craft an amendment that looks very similar to what, for example, European countries in the Council of Europe have, which has no minimums or maximums, just says the government's out there, we have to protect health. Would that help each of you if there was an articulated right to health?
I think we already have that in the 14th Amendment, the right to life. I think the question will come down to who counts. Who counts? And I think that's the question. And I think that's the hardest question to answer. I think there's an easy answer to that, but many people disagree.
I think when you say a right to health, I have to go, what does that mean? Is there a definition? Is there a normal
Well, we'll leave
versus
aside
an
the
abnormal?
WHO definition because we no longer belong to WHO. But in fact, lots of countries have very interesting, vague and specific at the same time language about government obligations to protect individuals. They don't say everybody's entitled to open heart surgery, but they do indicate there's some responsibility on the part of the governance to worry about this issue. And that's been successful in a lot of countries. Specific language I'd love to sit and talk about.
Yeah, I mean, and again, if the vagueness is my worry, because what does that mean? And I could interpret it one way and Alta could interpret it another, and you're back basically to the same situation we're in now, where who's going to provide this, who's going to oversee it, that it's accurately carried out, and so on. So I don't think it would actually help from my perspective. Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I think, first of all, we need to talk about a right to health care as opposed to right to health. Nobody can guarantee a right to health. In terms of a right to health care, it is subject to this kind of problem. And I was just at a meeting last week in Strasbourg in France where I was listening. It was a gene therapy meeting. And I was listening to somebody from Argentina talking about the way in which their particular constitution's language had meant that people were going to court to demand multi-million-dollar treatments. And the courts were ordering that they be provided, even though this was breaking the budget. So it does come down to how one defines the universe of things that should be guaranteed. It is not, however, impossible. We have, in fact, through things like Obamacare, decided that here's a package of essential services that must be provided. And then there's other things that are more discretionary. So by collective action, we can decide what is going to be the core things that will constitute the government's obligation to provide basic health care and basic shelter, basic food. Again, revealing biases, I'd be all for it because I'm tired of seeing people sleeping on the street and unable to get a sandwich or basic care for their illnesses. Would that solve the problems we've been talking about?
That's my question.
I don't know that it would. It would certainly reduce the demand for some kinds of advanced healthcare services if people were actually getting basic services early enough that they didn't develop more complicated disorders down the line. That's certainly true.
Thank you.
Thank you. One final question.
Okay, well, you guys have talked a lot. Sorry, I'm Caleb Stevens from Florida, SG's office. But you've talked a lot about a lot of technologies that sound like science fiction, as a lot of you have mentioned. But as somebody who reads a lot of sci-fi and fantasy, a lot of these materials are things that I'm somewhat vaguely familiar, even as a non-scientist, just attorney, from that speculative area. So I was kind of curious to hear your insights on whether fiction, the impact of fiction on your field, whether by making people more familiar with the base ideas of technology, familiarizing them with potential ethical dilemmas, or whether they portray, these fields in a light that's just so unrealistic it winds up harming the debate rather than helping it.
I think that fiction can be very helpful I think a lot of these discussions are arguments and debates, and sometimes seeing even fictional stories help us approach the answer to what we think is moral or immoral more closely than an argument or a debate would. I will say, though, that Dr. Prentice mentioned the movie Gattaca, and if you haven't seen it, it's very good. I highly recommend it. But it seems like people took it, instead of as a warning, they looked at it like a playbook. Like, let's just make this happen. And I think that's totally missing the mark. So I don't think that it can solve all the problems. I think it can definitely help. But man, it really seems like people get the exact wrong message, even whenever it's clearly laid out in front of them.
I'm also a big fan of that genre. I think that that kind of literature is incredibly helpful because it allows people to take a technology and then play out its implications for daily life, for how people interact with one another, and for its societal effects. And I think there's a genre, I don't believe that the genre is always directed one way or the other. We've got the cautionary tale genre, and then we have the bio-optimistic genre, right? And they both serve a very valuable purpose because they show us the kind of range of potential avenues where this might go. I think it also helps open up our imaginations. I mean, I grew up on Dr. McCoy in the original Star Trek series, who would press what I now understand was actually a salt shaker against somebody's arm and they would be cured. That is in vivo genetic editing. That is what we are trying to do now, 60 years after that series was created. We're trying to figure out how you can squirt something into somebody's body and it would target only the organ of interest and only the cells of interest and edit only the genes of interest with no off-target effects. And then miraculously somebody's disease is cured. And that is what we've been imagining for 60 years because somebody like Gene Roddenberry had that idea. So I love how it opens up our imaginations.
And it may have been epigenetic and not genetic, but nonetheless, you got this quick sort of response. And there's some cases where we're sort of moving towards that now. And again, I grew up on science fiction. I loved reading all of the books and so on. And I think the arts give us a window into the future. That window will be opened based on the particular director's or author's viewpoint and how they would like to send you. So I would propose that we need to look at lots of those movies and read lots of those books to get a wealth of understanding. But I do think that it does fire our imagination up and it helps us look at what might be, and then we can make a decision. Do I really want that kind of future or not?
Right.
Yeah. Thank you all.
Great. Before we thank our panelists, I just want to make one announcement. The next program is the Rosencrantz Luncheon and Debate, and that's going to be in the International Ballroom Center, and that's going to start directly after this panel. So hopefully you all will make your way over there. But with that, I do want to thank our panelists. This was a great discussion, I think. So thank you very much.